Roundtable Osteuropa. Ein Podcast des Zentrums für Osteuropa und internationale Studien.
Welcome to another episode of the ZEUS podcast Roundtable Osteuropa. Today we want to talk about research ethics, a pretty abstract sounding term. Some of the most common associations we might have with it, for example, from the medical field, animal testing, or from computer science with artificial intelligence. Social sciences and humanities might be the less common associations for most of us. However, they rely on the interaction of researchers with other humans for collecting their source material. For example, humans as interview partners, as experts or eyewitnesses, as writers or activists. Whether in field research, when conducting interviews, or in handling of data, there is a balance to be struck between the right of researchers to generate and publish source material and research results, and the need to protect their human research partners or subjects. In some circumstances, those kind of ethical considerations become even more essential, for example, in crises, wars, in context of authoritarian rule, or when the research participants are part of a socially vulnerable group. So actually, research ethics in social sciences can include very concrete, sometimes even physical aspects of security. There are some urgent questions to discuss. I'm lucky to have with me two researchers, Leda Rehuiashvili, researcher at the Leibniz Institute for Regional Geography in Leipzig. She has a PhD in political science and, among others, is interested in political economy and urban geography, in post-socialist and post- or decolonial dialogues, and focuses particularly on the South Caucasus and Central Asia. Hello, Lila.
Hello, Hannah, and thanks for having me here.
And I have also with me Nina Fries. She is a research fellow at ZEUS and has a background in political science and Slavic studies, focusing, among other, on the relationship between politics and literature and Russian contemporary culture. And she is also a member of the ZEUS Ethics Commission. Hi, Nina.
Hi, Hannah. Thanks for having me.
And my name is, as you heard it, Hannah Guhlmann. I'm a research communications trainee at ZEUS, and my very own last experience of collecting and analyzing data in social science was for my master's thesis, which happened during COVID lockdowns. So I relied on digitalized, publicly available archive material. And the thesis was also not intended for publication. So actually only since starting my work at ZEUS, where conducting fieldwork abroad or conducting fieldwork at all is an everyday conversation, I have also started to really think about ethical questions in research. So to start off, Nina and Lila, could you take me back to your own very first experiences of conducting research or being in the field where you became aware of your responsibility and the potential impact of your work on research participants?
Again, thanks, Hannah, for having Nina and myself for this very interesting question. And indeed, for me, thinking of ethics questions starts with the first actual qualitative fieldwork. This is happening back in 2010, and it is in my second MA program back then. And it was exactly after I had worked for a year for a demining organization. And that was a odd sounding but very interesting job. It was exactly after the war that Russia waged against Georgia at that point, or a war between Georgia or Russia as well, as you want to say. And that year I had worked for the demining organization that was that was doing battle area clearance after the war, right? Removing war remnants. And at that point, I was exposed a lot to internal displacement and to the camps that Georgian government, very ad hoc camps that Georgian government had set up for the displaced persons after the war. After that experience, as I started doing MA, I was very motivated to go back there and talk to people how these camps that were being erected in front of my eyes had worked out for them. What I didn't anticipate, and sadly I had not such a good training at that point to think of ethics questions, was that these were deeply traumatized persons, deeply traumatized families that had very recently experienced forceful displacement and had gone through war. And as I came to talk to them about how their new living environment was for them, all they could talk about was what they had left behind. So in quite a few of the interviews, and I think back then I conducted over 20, up to 25 interviews, people would cry, people would really bring up emotional issues. And I still hope retrospectively that I didn't do anything particularly damaging, but I indeed got confronted with the fact that sometimes our interviews can bring up emotional issues that we are not necessarily trained to handle. So yeah, this was my first encounter, and that was for me the time where I realized that I had to learn of how to do interview in very different ways than what I was exposed before, right? Considering ethical implications of it much more and much more in advance than what I had done at that point.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a scholar for literature, and as such, I today mainly deal with literary texts that are already published in one way or another. But of course, these texts are written by authors, and in case you deal with contemporary literature, these authors are most likely still alive. And while I don't care too much about whether authors like my analysis of their texts or not, I, of course, care about what could happen if my analysis brings attention to the author by, let's say, the wrong people. To give an example, in 2017, I went to Kazakhstan for the first time. And in a bookshop, I came across a fascinating fairy tale collection written by a Kazakhstani author of Polish origin, which aimed at children. But it bears a lot of very friendly, but for an authoritarian regime as Kazakhstan is one, still remarkable criticism. And I was asking myself, could I, as a foreign scholar, write about this? Because we know that Kazakhstani authorities sometimes pay more attention to what foreigners say and write about Kazakhstan than to what their own people say and write. So what I basically did was I asked the author whether I could write about his book, and we also took an interview, and I let him double check all the quotes I was going to use, and this turned out to be a good way to deal with that.
Do you experience conflicts between your research interests and the protection of your research participants? And if so, how? So if you take it to the present.
Okay, maybe I start this time. And yes, of course, but in a way that my respondents often care less about their security than I do. I sometimes have to decide that I anonymize a quote, even I got permission to quote a person, or I won't quote someone at all if I think that this might do harm to him or her. And with published texts, which are my main source as a scholar of literature, it's, well, easier and more difficult at the same time. On the one hand, they're already out in the world. On the other hand, as I already mentioned, my attention might bring them more attention than they would usually gain. So, as I already said, I would always ask the authors to give me their permission to deal with a certain text if I consider the situation as potentially dangerous for the authors.
Nina, I find it amazing that you emphasize this, and I totally agree. I share this experience that very often our respondents might feel brave. I've had many instances where people would say, look, put my name under this. There is additional layer of complication there because I sometimes feel like, okay, I personally would decide that it's not okay to put down your name once I'm writing up. On the other hand, I also understand that sometimes people want to be acknowledged. And it's a tricky balance that we need to navigate between acknowledging and ensuring safety of our research participants. Now, to go back to the question of whether our research interests and our research participants' safety concerns come into conflict. Maybe it's not necessarily into conflict, but it's really about how to protect safety of our research participants that in itself is very complicated and sometimes makes us do research and write up our research in specific ways. I wouldn't for me, research interest or research goal is never so important as to at any point put it above the protection of either my own or research participants' safety. But it's not about that. It's not about putting that above, but it's even if you're extremely good willing in assuring everybody's safety, it's very difficult to decide upon this, what is the safest option. From my personal experience, I can recall that I've been doing in past years research with a very loud and politically important social movement. And I was really also part of the social movement, and it's a very delicate and politically complicated issue to then talk about it and write about it, because you know that if you reveal certain strategies of the movement, the forces that you don't want to be using this information might be using this information. And this is just a very acknowledged concern that many social movement scholars have, that if you reveal how the movement mobilizes, it might be used by the state or other actors that are involved in very outright oppressive dynamic with them. So I observed myself, and in the end, really instead of drawing on my more anthropological work, what I did when writing up a book and in Georgian language on this, where the fieldwork was set, I observed myself really relying extensively on publicly available texts to just navigate this thing that I'm not talking about anything that would expose them more than what is already publicly circulating. And it's an interesting writing choice, because I would have very different sources to also talk about this. But I think it's just such a big challenge to handle that I felt much safer always referring back to already available texts and already available discourses. Each time, if you ask me, these questions come up and they always have different solutions in a certain way.
Speaking about different solutions, we've talked about how you go back to what already exists and work with your background knowledge. And Nina, you've also talked about getting consent or contacting someone beforehand, before you start working with a source. What happens if circumstances or attitudes change while you're in the middle of collecting data or conducting interviews, and how can you adjust?
Well, I fortunately have not experienced that personally, but what I took from discussions with colleagues and also from the literature was that one, of course, should be always ready to change initial plans, especially when one works with vulnerable groups. And well, this means, for instance, that we should always offer a possibility to take a break from an interview, to continue it later, or maybe at another place. And well, if everything goes wrong, and this is, of course, something we all try to avoid, we just have to cancel the talk, the interview. We just have to leave the situation if it becomes too difficult or even traumatizing for the interview or also for ourselves.
Totally agreed.
Speaking about planning research projects or field trips, you spoke about us, Nina, this mitigation of risk beforehand and this creating awareness. To what degree is this already institutionalized or actually up to individuals and researchers themselves?
Well, at SOIS, we have an ethics committee, and every new project needs to get an approval of the Institute's ethics committee. We have certain forms to be filled out for this. Not all of us love them, but they somehow trigger a process of reflection, and it makes us think about certain risks for participants, but again, also for us. And interestingly enough, the latter is something researchers tend to forget about. And yeah, this process is of course institutionalized, and you shouldn't start your project before you get this ethical approval. But I think it's not only up to the institute, but also up to the researcher, but because this process of reflection really makes your research better. And this is something we all want. And for me, it's kind of important because we often talk about getting ready for field work. And I think most of us really spend lots of time getting prepared for field work, but research ethics continues, of course, in the fields. This is more or less clear, but it also continues afterwards. And I think this kind of debriefing or follow-ups, not only for yourself, but also together with colleagues, this is something we could improve. We could institutionalize a little bit more, also because it makes future fieldwork easier and because it's an interesting possibility to exchange thoughts on fieldwork, on certain questions, not only concerning research ethics, with your colleagues.
If I may continue what Nina was saying, first of all, very much agreeing again that on the one hand, it's very important to have and to set up ethics committees that are serving as formal procedures to kind of go through your plans and anticipated ethical challenges. And I think this is crucial, especially when we are starting our research, if we are early career researchers or even advanced researchers, to collectively deliberate on what kind of challenges could arise and what could we do in the field to address and navigate them. But as Nina was saying, this is never truly enough. And researchers increasingly acknowledge this and come up with new concepts. I think these are very interesting tools and readings to address the situation where just ethics committee is not enough. For example, situated ethics or pragmatic dualistic approach to ethics that point out this continuous need to engage with ethics also after we have successfully submitted applications to ethics committees and passed the committee reviews. And there is where I particularly want to point out again what Nina was saying, that we need more institutionalization of support over the research project's lifetimes to reflect again on ethical issues. And this is on the one hand to support each other to address those issues that we have not yet anticipated but are coming up. And we can always make different calls and address the issues that are coming up, but it's always better to have collective spaces or institutionalized spaces to address this. But also sometimes it is a lot about helping us as researchers, because we also come with very difficult, challenging stories, and we need to be heard out, and we need to have supportive environments where we can articulate our concerns. So I would always, for researchers and for people in training, like for MA students, PhD students, create repeated opportunities to collectively address ethics questions, to learn about it, and once they're faced, to have environment where they can bring it up, and also to really set up more institutional ways of addressing challenges, because sometimes we might be in the field work and we need to ask, like, who is the next person that we can approach quickly and ask them if we are not feeling safe or if we need to change our plans, who will serve as our support base in this sense. And I think the more tools we elaborate for this, the better for everybody's safety and also for the quality of our research.
I really want to come back to this aspect of researchers' own backgrounds. But first, let's get a bit more specific about the regions that both of you and also Zeus cover in research projects. So Eastern Europe, or Europe more broadly, the South Caucasus and Central Asia, multiple regions actually, and very diverse ones. And so despite geographical closeness and some shared history, even neighboring states can have really radically different circumstances when it comes to research, academic freedom, the political system that you operate within. And even within a country and small countries, you can find very different circumstances, be it war or just because there are autonomous regions or regional regimes, de facto regimes. What is the variety of circumstances, political systems that you have encountered, and how has this maybe influenced how you have approached your research?
Well, I would really like to work on democratic systems one day, but so far, for whatever reasons, my research was mostly related to unfree societies. And this is, of course, something that influences me and my approaches, my possibilities very, very much. And also, given that I've spent more than 2 years living in a non democratic system, namely in Belarus, I maybe tend to be kind of overcautious, or, well, some of my colleagues even say paranoid from time to time. But I think at the end of the day, this caution, the permanent reflection on my own and other people's research, safety, and so on improves findings and makes research more valuable on the long run.
As a former political scientist, I understand that there is a certain common understanding that some systems are just more open, less repressive, some others are more repressive. Yet it always depends on who you are and what you're covering, what you're fighting with and against. If I may say this, I mean, these days I'm sometimes more concerned of Germany than of Georgia. I am like in this what we call democratic society, I do find it very hard to articulate solidarity with Palestine on various levels. And it really, I mean, there might be range of other topics that we can very freely speak of, and we can very freely exercise our rights, and range of topics where you can't. And I think also in authoritarian contexts, there is, or what we call, or what is classified as authoritarian context. And I must emphasize, like, I've done research in Kyrgyzstan back in 2016, and in all honesty, it was quite open environment back then. And in Georgia, which is not quite democratic, but it's also not extremely repressive, especially when I think of contrasting place like Georgia with where Nina works, right? Kazakhstan or Belarus. I mean, these are differently oppressive contexts. So what I imagine is that even in more repressive environments, it's very important to see what are the spaces of more repression and less repression. In Georgian context, I can surely say that there will be a range of topics that one can discuss and one can mobilize for and against, and it will be okay. And there is a range of topics that will not be okay. It also depends on who we talk about, which social groups, which social classes. Some groups will be more vulnerable, and we need to take care of them as researchers in a very different way than some others. So let's say not just the overall classification of political regime, but very specific group-based, issue-based issues that breakdown is necessary to differently engage with ethics topics, let's say in different times, in different places, or to carry different sensibilities. And I think you raised this question also before, that situations might change, even within the same country, even within the same city. In a couple of months, certain topic might get problematized very differently. It might attract different political attention, and things that seemed a bit safer to do a couple of months ago now might become much more sensitive, and it might also retrospectively change the ways we can or cannot, or we should or should not talk about our research, right? Maybe in the light of specific repoliticization of topics, we might need to take extra precautions on the findings, or the ways we are sharing the findings from our pre-existing research.
Absolutely, I can only second this. It's amazing to see in how circumstances influences what we can do in the field. And, well, I, for example, started working on Kazakhstan in 2016-17. And when I first came to Kazakhstan, there was much more pressure. Even people from the cultural field I'm mainly working on and with were not so open. And after Nazarbayev stepped back in 2019, and interestingly enough, after the Bloody January events, the situation completely changed and people were more willing to talk about what was going on, what plans they have. But this is, of course, something that is very much related to the cultural scene and sphere. And then now at the same time that colleagues who deal with completely different topics, for example, migration or national identity, that people, well, at the same time, like only I was there in April and they were there in May, that people would not want to talk about this. So it very much depends on who you are, what are you doing research on, and whom you are talking to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's finally come to this point of who we are. You're both affiliated with German research institutions, but we have different upbringings and different trajectories, educational trajectories. So both for how you yourselves interact with your research partners or participants and how they perceive you, what role does this play?
I would say positionality always matters, but the ways it matters always differs, and it's always relational. So I don't think I can tell one story of how my positionality has reflected on my research. Also, we change. It's different when I was a PhD student and doing, I back then also was studying in Budapest but had a small stipend versus now for 8 years employed at a German institute. I have much longer term safety. My salary is really very different from what my comrades earn in Georgia for very similar work or even much more intense work. So our situation changes over time. Our research participants and comrades and colleagues' situations change, and it will always affect in some ways or the other. But I have observed this I will not try to articulate this, or maybe you come back to me if what I say is not sufficient. But I have observed this tendency of people sometimes just stating who they are and saying this probably influences the field. That I'm a woman, yeah, sure, of course. I don't know, mostly perceived as white, middle age, and so on, probably middle class. But reflection on positionality is not just about stating what identities you think you carry. It's about really observing in the field how this plays out and how does it make you feel? How does it affect the way participants react to you, research participants react to you, and to see it also as an opportunity. Because of course, as a woman, when I do research with marshutka drivers, which is entirely male-dominated field, I will just never have access to certain types of sociability of marshutka drivers because I will simply not stay late evening drinking with them too long, right? Or at all. And this is something that my male colleagues could afford to do. But I'm pretty certain that being, I don't know, other shades of my identity, being a Georgian, living nearby to their end stations, having different accesses, also opens certain opportunities for me. And this is just, we simply need to reflect on the limits and possibilities that our various identities and the ways they're played out in specific times of our research can reflect on what we are able to see and what we're not able to see and engage with.
Yeah, it's a little bit boring, but of course, I couldn't agree more with Leila once again. Next time you have to invite other guests who don't agree with each other all the time. Yeah, but well, to talk about my case, I think I've received a lot of trust, which I'm very grateful for. And this is, of course, once again, something very specific for the cultural sphere my research is dedicated to. So local authors and also colleagues talk to me more openly because I'm an outsider. from a democratic country. And I already mentioned that. So this is really something specific and not true for all colleagues who, might work on completely different fields. For me, this trust gives also rise to the responsibility to handle my knowledge with care, to share it where necessary, but also to keep certain things safe and perhaps only share them at a later date or sometimes even not at all. Yeah, but this is something that comes along with my positionality as a person from the outside.
I just wanted to tell you one anecdote, actually, from one of my fieldworks, and this one was with petty traders that were at that point illegally trading on Tbilisi streets. And because at that point I was perceived more as a young middle class lady who was around, and I think my informants, the traders themselves, thought that because I, in their view, might have the power to visibilize some of the processes on the streets, they thought that the city enforcers or policemen would be scared of me. So they would, as the so-called city hall supervisors would appear a couple of times, my traders started really making a drama on the street, right? Being like, these guys are beating us up. Look, they are so repressive. And this was really a performative action that for which I was the single viewer. There were no journalists or other people. And indeed, I do think that my presence indeed carried power for the city hall supervisors because they were more cautious. And they're just not used to it because this was the topic that barely ever anyone was paying regular attention to. And I was there for months. But these types of episodes where your presence really disturbs the field is, again, a very important thing. And I don't think we should strive for rejecting our presence or the influence of our presence, because precisely this influence that my presence has sheds a different light on the dynamic between traders and city hall supervisors, including that over time, city hall supervisors would be like, yes, but you're now overdoing it. We're not that terrible. And then at one point, if you're there long enough, then the traders would be like, yes, you're not as terrible, but you did this and that. And then I would just witness the negotiation between them on how much responsibility city hall supervisors would take and how much responsibility traders would put on them. And these negotiations in themselves were very revealing because supervisors would also be like, yes, we did this and that, but we didn't do that and that. We were not that terrible. And this is precisely the relationships that I, as a researcher, want to be exposed to.
It's a very interesting point because I think you have to be sometime in the field to get into these things. So this would have not happened if you was there only for a week or so, a couple of days. And this also tells us that field trips shouldn't be too short.
I could not agree more. And I think also, I think for me, response to most of ethical questions is giving it time and more engagement. And Nina, you also pointed this out before, even in interviews. If you see that the person is not feeling good, the best you can do, the best you can address this challenge is to take a break and allow the research partner to choose maybe another time, another place. And this is simply really how much time we can invest in. Sometimes it's really also how much structurally limited or not limited we are to invest more time. And more time does allow us more care for ourselves and more care for our research participants.
And this is something we also should communicate to our institutions and to our founders, because research needs time, and to be aware of ethical issues also needs time.
Speaking of time, unfortunately, we have to wrap this up, but this last story was fascinating. So thank you for this. So do you have any final remarks? And to put you on the spot, do you have one do and one don't for every researcher thinking about these questions of research ethics?
Well, in a nutshell, do listen to your partners and participants and don't ignore your gut feeling.
I would say do get ready that you will face more ethical challenges than you could ever anticipate, even when you're a very experienced researcher. And do not privilege research interests over your own or your research participants' safety. Science doesn't matter as much.